So welcome everyone to our latest installment of the SOHO Brown Bag Insider. And it's my great privilege today to welcome Dr. Luke Fletcher, who's going to be walking us through what are the current challenges or barriers for sustaining a research program in a non-academic environment. Dr. Fletcher is at the Willamette Valley Cancer Institute, but also is the Leukemia Chair for Sarah Cannon Research Institute. And so Dr. Fletcher, welcome today. Happy to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Loretta. Yeah, I look forward to being here. So I think the first question is, why is this actually important? So I think if you're going to be doing something, saying, okay, we're trying to set up a community oncology or non-academic research program, we're trying to sustain that. So why is it important to be doing research in the community oncology setting, or why is it important in a non-academic setting? The first one is that actually that the majority of patients are treated at community sites. You could see estimations of between 70 and 80% of U.S. cancer patients are treated actually in community oncology or non-academic sites. This represents real-world patient populations. So if you're trying to extrapolate research data into actual meaningful, impactful data on a standard of care for patients ongoing, having it represent the real world as much as possible is actually paramount. It expands access to cutting edge therapies for patients in communities that maybe have not had those same access to patients in the past. It reduces geographic and socioeconomic disparities. I know, especially for, I'm in Oregon, the geographic distribution of patients is very, very spread out. Academic settings are few and far between, and it can be very far for patients to drive and maybe barriers for them to get access to more advanced care. It strengthens national trial enrollment capacity. And then kind of a why this is important. Those are kind of the, okay, this is what it can do, but why is this becoming a bigger interest is because there's an increasing interest from pharmaceutical companies in community oncology research as this is being expanded as available, and pharmaceutical companies are realizing actually how it is representative of the populations at large. It's becoming more and more interested from that side of it, which is an important barrier to break down. And along that, it's always important to contrast how things are slightly different in community oncology, because that's actually the way forward in breaking down barriers and saying, hey, I'm not going to do it the same way I would do it at an academic center, but how can I do research effectively that is impactful for patients and for the research community at large. The academic model is all under one roof. There's some collaborations on, maybe a site or two, but a lot of it is going to be done at each academic center. They're a referral center for trials, so therefore people are going to say, okay, yes, I'm going to send them here and see what trials they have available, but it's kind of self-contained. In the community model, it's hard to be an all under one roof model, to be a singular site, just with the amount of resources that are needed to do research, with the ability to get trials. It is hard to do all on yourself. And so that model is less possible. And so therefore, it's done often through research partnerships and consortiums. So it's spread over many roofs, as I like to say. So Sarah Cannon Research Institute, which I'm a part of, and I'm on the Leukemia Executive Committee, I'm the chair of the Leukemia Executive Committee, is one such model through the U.S. Oncology Network. This is a cancer partnership consortium of many community oncology sites, actually, that all work together under one umbrella for research. Similar ones, like One Oncology has one like this. There's other groups also that have these community oncology groups that all work together with some administrative support and ability to then be able to talk with companies about trials with and say, hey, we have all these potential sites that can do it, which increases the ability to accrue faster and more effectively, and as well as with some assurance that there's going to be accruals. Obviously, trial is clinical. It's clinical trial based, no lab based research, and it's mainly outpatient based. I'll talk a little bit about that, the hospital versus non-hospital, briefly. There's always options for QI projects. So I divided the community oncology pitfalls or barriers into kind of three broad categories, and we'll walk through each of those in a little more detail. The first one is the historical divide between academic community and the understanding between each. One of those is, from one side is that community oncologists are spread too thin. They don't have specific interests, and that is precluding their ability to do trials effectively. And then some of that is that historical community oncology is not viewed as viable options for research, and the reliance on academic centers from the pharmaceutical side as well. The next one is trying to do research and trials the same way as you do in academics. I mentioned that briefly earlier. This is a big part of my practice in general, both as a leukemia specialist as well as a researcher, is not actually thinking through, okay, I'm going to do it exactly how I did it when I was at OHSU or an academic institution, but what is the problem I'm trying to answer or fix? And how do I get to that with a different potential solution? So you get to the same end result, but it may look slightly different in how you got to that result. So part of that, though, is knowing your site, right? So select trials that you know your site can do and have patience for. It seems basic, but it's actually important tenet of research the best way to build a program is to show yourself effective with the what you're actually entrusted with from the start. Knowing, hospital-based versus non-hospital-based. So we have a hospital partner, but I do not have the ability to actually admit patients for trials, actually specifically inpatient trials. So I'm more outpatient focused in terms of my trial. And then know your support services and what type of research you have that way to be effective. And then the last one is trying to do research alone. So collaborative is absolutely a must in my mind. Before I go any further into the pitfalls from a community oncology perspective, I'd also like to mention just about some pitfalls that are shared between academic and communities. So the ever shifting winds of the FDA, funding, all those things, there's definitely some shared research is research, and you're going to have some of those same struggles between those. But specifically focus on some of those community oncology specific ones. Going to the first one in terms of lack of specialists. So moving forward, there's a new generation of community oncology research, which is more regionalist or more specialist in nature. What I found in my practice is that a lot of community oncology practices now are welcoming people who want to focus on specific disease types. It may see a couple, but are definitely focused in that way. As the data continues to grow and grow and the field continues to change rapidly, it's hard to stay up to date with every single piece of research and the new drugs. But if each is individually working on those different areas, then it all kind of raises the ships together. I'll say for my practice right now, so I'm in a community oncology setting. 75% of my practice is malignant hematology, and the vast majority of that is myeloid malignancies, and I have 25% other. So I'm a strong regionalist, border non-specialist in terms of what I do on a day-to-day basis. But the bigger deal is also what you do beyond just the patients that you see, but actually is to own your diseases. And so having a champion who champions research and specific disease types is often the way forward in community oncology practice. So I can say for mine, I am the myeloid champion in my practice. So not only do I enroll patients on trials, but I'm the one everyone comes to, just as you would go to an academic center and say, hey, do you have any trials? My colleagues will come to me and say, hey, do you have trials in X, Y, or Z diseases? So having someone who wants to champion that from a actual practice standpoint and actually patient care, but also from a research standpoint is very important. And so that's really, I think, the biggest way forward on community oncology is have someone who wants to champion research and wants to champion specific disease types and works together. We have champions in lung, we have champions in CLL and lymphoma, we have champions in myeloma, we have a champion in GYN oncology, actually my practice as well too. We have gynecologic oncologists. Each of us owning our specific spaces and making sure that those trials are successful in those areas. And then there's the changing discussion around community oncology. So, okay, this may be a viable way to potentially do research, and specifically certain types of patients are more enriched in communities than others. So a good example of this in my world in the myeloid diseases, so something like essential thrombocythemia or polycythemia vera is often much more enriched in a community oncology setting than is going to be actually at an academic setting. And so trials in those spaces may be even more available actually to enroll patients at my site than they may be in an academic setting. So that's part of that, is that they're realizing some of that change in paradigm in terms of where patients are, better selected trials that way. The other kind of way around it too as well is you want to change the discussion around it. You want to change what the thought is around it. Do well, be productive. And so as you can think about it, the best way to change the narrative is to show that the narrative is dead. And so that is do research well. And so at my site we're really pushing to be able to do research well, accrue patients, take trials that we can do well, and show that we can be a viable research opportunity for our network as well as for trials. And that gets a little bit into patient volumes. So know your clinic, but also your clinic's volume. So champion the diagnosis your trials on, as I mentioned before, and use the resources at your disposal to calculate volumes. So say, hey, I think we see a lot of this, prove it. So use whatever you can to look at historical accruals if you have historical accruals, or if you're getting started, you're not going to have historical accruals, but like there's resources potentially in your network or at your different sites that can give estimations of, hey, how many patients do we see with this diagnosis? And they'll be able to extrapolate from there saying, hey, how many potential patients may be eligible? I'll say for our network, we have the ability to access something called Genospace, through Sarah Cannon and US Oncology. And this actually has the ability to identify molecular markers, say, hey, at your site, you've seen 20 patients with IDH1 mutations in the last year or things like that. And that can also help, especially when those molecular targeted, but even just general targeted by a disease type, being able to identify how many patients at your site may be available to that. It's also a learning ongoing experience. So you sometimes will take trials and say, hey, I think we can accrue to this. and then you don't accrue as well as you want to. And then so the question is why? So asking yourself why, saying, hey, is this potentially something that like this disease type at this diagnosis is hard because of certain things? Can we mitigate those issues, or are those issues not being able to be mitigated? So we're unable to potentially enroll to that specific disease status at this point. But then how do in the future we become better that we can actually enroll to at that diagnosis, whether frontline or relapse refractory or things like that. For instance, in my world, leukemia and AML, at the diagnosis, where are they diagnosed? How are they diagnosed? How do we get molecular? All questions I have to answer to potentially get someone on trial. So some of those pitfalls actually can play a role. So if they're admitted, and most of our patients end up being admitted, and I can't do hospital research, those are all some of those different things you have to navigate in learning your site and what the next steps forward are. And the last piece of portion of that is after you continue to learn is don't take trials you can't recruit to. Don't develop such a big portfolio just to have options. It's better if you can say slightly leaner and accrue really well to those studies and prove yourself capable than it is to say, hey, I have 20 trials and I didn't enroll to any of them. So, and part of that is learning your volumes and continuing refining over time. The next pitfall, as I mentioned, was clinic resources. So know what your clinic can do research-wise. Hospital versus outpatient. Support services. So, do you have nurses that can see patients with you? Who's doing all the IRB checks? Who's doing making sure all the regulatory stuff is up to snuff and is being maintained? What is your clinic and infusion hours? So, how long does it take to give these drugs? What types of PKs does the trial require? And so, what can you do based on that? So, for instance, some phase 1 studies may not be accessible if you can't do 8-hour PKs or things like that. That can be an issue. How do you balance your clinic and research time? So, how much time do you have allotted from the clinician to do research? Do you have a research nurse available and assisting you, which I do? Do you have time off to be able to go to research conferences? And what is the other clinical resource support to be able to give drugs? The next one is funding. So negotiating rates in community oncology can be tricky. This is especially an issue in investigator-initiated trials, and something I'm still working on because the rates negotiated for IITs at non-academic centers can be really high compared to the academic sites, and this is still an ongoing issue of how to figure that out. The second one is how profit or money is made in community oncology practice versus academics. It's less profitable than standard practice, and so you need to have a mutual understanding of what your goals are because it's important to the patient. So I'll tell you, at my practice, our goal is not to make a bunch of money off research. Our goal is to actually do research, push the field forward, and to somewhat break even at least. If you make a little bit, great, but that's not the main driving force at all. The main driving force is to push patient care forward. And so that mutual understanding in the practice amongst me and also those that don't do research is really important because that allows me to be able to do my job, and that requires ongoing relationships and partnerships. So I mentioned the third pitfall being isolation or trying to do it on your own. So you need collaborations with your colleague at your practice. I mentioned already about potential collaborations beyond your own practice. I benefit from colleagues, though, that want to do other cancers and focus on that, provides trial options for patients that I may have as well as it raises the profile of my practice to be able to do research in a productive manner. But the other part about it is a mutual understanding of commitment to research. As I said, we talked about some of the financial stuff on that previous slide, but also I've never been given any issues, and there's a clear understanding of it's important for me and for my practice that I allow time for research and meetings. So I attend ASH every year. I attend ASCO every year. And sometimes there's other meetings that I may be required to go to because I'm asked to go to. And I've never felt like, oh, you're taking away time for the practice, but it's beneficial to the practice, the research that I do, and the ability it has to improve our patients' care and also our facilities' care. So just a little bit of how all these kind of pitfalls work out in terms of how I navigate some of these things, and just a little bit about my career and how it's been enriched actually in the community in ways I actually didn't even know, and ways I don't know if it would have been the same exactly if I was in a academic center. So I'm part of the Sarah Cannon Research Institute. I am the chair of the Leukemia Executive Committee. I'm on PI in around 13 studies. When I started, though, about 5 years ago, we had one myeloid study. It was Verona, actually. So AZA-VEN versus AZA and MDS. Now we have frontline AML, MDS, PV, CML studies, relapse refractory AML studies, ET, MF studies, the full gamut, basically, of myeloid diseases we have trials for at this time. As I mentioned before, I attend multiple meetings per year. I've had the fortunate ability to be on Encoded PQI and AZA-VEN, invited panelists at the NCCN Heme Malignancy Conference, and it was on the ASH Elderly AML Guidelines Committee, actually, that finished their guidelines end of last year. So my research academic pursuits have been very much enriched and fulfilled in the community setting. So I want to leave basically what has been my motto, which is charting my own path. And it's really challenge the paradigms you see you cannot do in research in the community. So for me, It was, okay, you can't do AML in the community. Well, why not? What do I need to do to be able to do that? You can't do AML research in the community. Okay, well, why not? How do I challenge that, right? And so thinking differently with the same goal at the end of mind, one of the biggest things is adapt. So don't give up, but adapt. So say, okay, know my community, know my resources. How do I effectively use my resources that I have now? And how do I grow my resources over time to do even more? And one of the biggest things is be a local expert and carve your own niche. You don't have to do exactly the same thing that others do, but being a local expert and owning and championing your diseases and championing the trials that you're on, championing your research is what's going to push it forward. So this is what the Sarah Cannon Research Institute looks like. So this is a map of the U.S. These are all practices across the U.S. actually that have that are part of SCRI. There's about 1,300 plus research positions, about 1,000 trials actively enrolling all over the US that we're a part of. With that, actually, that concludes my slides. I want to save some time for questions.
Thank you so much. And just to remind our audience, the Q&A is now open. I'm happy to navigate that. And while we may be waiting for some questions to be supplied, I have a couple questions for you, Luke. I really appreciate your insights into some of the pitfalls, but also sort of championing how important it is to do research well. And obviously, you come from an academic background, so you brought that expertise with you. What guidance can you share in terms of either establishing mentorship or sponsorship for community oncologists that may not have had the strong academic background and be as familiar with research? You're clearly interested in launching a community research program.
So I think there's twofold thing I'll say. So if you're going into a site that has done some research before and you're trying to expand on that beyond what, let's say you're doing breast and you're trying to do blood cancer research, you're doing hematology, right? So I think the first thing is when I took my job that I took here in Eugene, there was a lot of people doing research, but there was no one doing what I wanted to do. So there was mentorship available at my site to be able to say, hey, this is how community oncology works, research works, but not necessarily like, hey, we're going to hand you 5 trials for AML and MDS, and there you go, now build, right? So I think the first thing is finding if there's mentorship at your site that does other research, great. It doesn't have to be exactly what you want to do, right? I think that's some of that understanding. So that's the first thing. But if there's not that, I think there's looking for outside of that, right? And so I think from, I would say in our network, we're always looking for additional sites that have motivation and interest in wanting to expand research beyond that too as well. You may have to go outside your site to ability to provide some of those, but I think what it is say, okay, find a starting point of saying, I can really do well at this diagnosis or this treatment, do really well at that first trial, right? It's actually what I tell people about using new drugs. So when you use a drug for the first time that you've not used before, the first time you use that drug is going to be your biggest eye opener for you and for patients and saying, hey, is this a good drug that actually works or not? And it doesn't matter. You can look at all the trial data you want and say, hey, there's this responses. But if you have a poor experience with that drug the first time you get it, it's going to struggle to want to give that again. It's the same thing with trials. If the first time you give a trial or do a trial, that it's like, oh man, we really slogged to be able to do this. And the sponsor's been on my back the whole time because we have not enrolled well to the trial. That's going to not want to make you motivated to continue to do research and or open doors for research. So I think it's also that selection of that first thing you do is important there. So find mentorship inside of your group. I chose my job partially because I knew I was going to have mentorship. That was a huge part of why I chose what is. It was going to be, I was going to do something different. So I had my own niche, but I had mentorship. If there's not mentorship inside of your group, look for mentorship outside your group. And then finally, as you select your first trial or two, make sure that it's trials you can enroll really well to, that you're going to have success.
And I guess along those lines, how do you fund your research staff? Since that's generally not funded by pharma, at least to kick it off. And so again, do you leverage resources within your institution, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so there are a couple things. So, and this is probably why accruals of a certain number per trial matters. You get one on a trial, it's hard to break even one on a trial, right? If you get a couple accruals on the study, each study you do, you can start to break even. So our rates and everything is negotiated through Sarah Cannon. So Sarah Cannon will give us money per patient to take care of them. And that, as I said, the break even point usually, or making a little bit of money, it's usually 3 or 4 patients per trial. And so that's what we're shooting for usually, is at least 3 or 4 patients per trial. So most of our funding comes internally, but those have been negotiated with the company already by central Sarah Cannon, if that makes sense. So most of our research staff is paid for through US Oncology. That's part of the administrative deal that we have.
Can you walk us through sort of your network? So if you decide you're going to open a trial in AML, do you have a systematic approach for how many sites you might engage? Because I can imagine you can leverage the Sarah Cannon Research Institute, or you could leverage individual sites. How does that work?
Yeah, no, great question. So what will happen? Usually either we'll get a lead or I have enough contacts on contacts that, hey, we have this trial we're interested in. And so they'll go basically through the scientific director for our committee. So they'll get basically all the contracting signed to be able to see the protocol, everything like that. And then if there's interest, it goes to central committee first. So our executive committee meets weekly. In fact, I have a meeting here in 2 hours with them. And so we meet weekly and we review trials weekly. And the goal is to be made flexible and nimble to be able to evaluate trials on a quick basis to, if it's a good trial, to move forward as expediently as possible. So we'll review that for a couple things. One is it something we should pursue from a scientific standpoint, from a medical standpoint? And then if yes, where? So, and it's always an evaluation as part of that group, is saying not just, oh yeah, this is really scientifically good, let's do it, but like, hey, if we're going to do this, where should we do this? And often trials will say, hey, we want X number of sites. So we're always kind of negotiating that a little bit. But a part of that too, as well, is we're looking at saying, okay, what's required with the study? So is it inpatient, outpatient? What are the PKs? How are they doing the molecular testing? If it's a molecular driven trial, all those things are part of that discussion. And then we're looking at, hey, what trials are already out there that we may have competing with this? Where are those trials? And so then being able to potentially reach out and say, hey, this may be a good trial for your site, or having people who are shareholder or stakeholders in those different places say, hey, where are you looking for trials? So it's a balance of those kind of all those things together in terms of how we actually select trials, but also enroll them out at specific sites.
And I really appreciate your comments about looking at who you bring forward to trials, because there are some potential differences between what we see commonly in community practice versus what's going to be referred out to large tertiary centers. Yeah. And so how do you establish that collaborative nature where you can engage your sort of core group of folks to understand, where do you have an unmet need? Where can you enroll trials well? And how do you get folks to essentially acknowledge you as being a champion in a specific niche population such as heme malignancy?
So I'm fortunate because we had some of this kind of in place to some degree before. But like AML is kind of its own little world too as well. And especially in the community, it's not been championed or wanted to be championed for understandable reasons. But along those lines though, so one thing is, so we have monthly meetings for research. That's part of it. But some of it is just showing diligence over time. So if you're going to be a champion, so you need to do some work to know what your site does and can't do. So I made myself available. That was one. So I said, hey, I want to do this. And then you make yourself available. So when someone calls and say, I need help, you help them, right? And so part of it is building that trust with your colleagues, especially if you're new, that this is something that you're going to do and that can do as well. So from the scheduling standpoint, you say, hey, I will see any and all of these. So you load your schedule to say new patients should come and see me. And that was part of the agreement. Also, when I started, was like, hey, I want to see the AML, please. I really want it all consolidated to me as much as possible. But there's still some seen by other people, not a lot, but some. And so having that open door of saying, hey, I want to be helpful and being helpful, not just say you want to be helpful, but actually following through, allows you to build that rapport with your colleagues. And then some of that over time is repetition. So I'm sending out emails saying, hey, here's our trials in these spaces. If you have patients in these spaces, and over time it becomes easier and less work because my colleagues know to come ask me now. I have this, I have MDS. I'll go talk to Luke and see what we have from a trial perspective. So some of that becomes more standard over time. They know to ask, but I'm still sending reminders, especially with new trials or ones I'm really excited about or I think can enroll well to say, hey, I have this open trial. Make sure if you have an MDS new diagnosis, you talk to me about it.
And maybe the last question for you, the business model we can't ignore, but maybe slightly different in community practice as opposed to academic medicine. So how do you leverage having protected time in community practice and balancing that with sustaining a viable practice? Because as you mentioned, some of this you're hoping to break even because it's the right thing to do and it's the right way to advance the field. So how do you negotiate that?
Yeah. So I think there's an internal and an external, right? So internally, it's interesting, often it's like I take a bunch of time off for research. I'm going to be less productive. And it's really interesting. You look at the data, at least I can tell you from a Sarah Cannon standpoint, the doctors that enroll like the most patients on trials are about 30% more productive than doctors that don't enroll on trials. So it's actually the opposite of what you would honestly think, like, oh, you're taking time away from seeing other patients, so therefore your productivity is going to go down. In reality, it often goes up, which is interesting. So because of that, in our group, there's not a big discussion or concern about like, hey, I need to go to this meeting or that and take time off. That's not a concern. The reality is I don't have to do that much time off. My support staff around me is really good. And so a lot of those nuts and bolts and crossing T's and dotting I's, they take care of for me. So the big things I still have to, but I think that's a lot of it is that it's actually less of a concern, and the time commitment is less than you think if you have good support services, that the financial piece actually doesn't like affect it too much at all, actually.
Well, I'm really encouraged to know that there's folks like you out there leading the charge for getting good, well conducted research done in community practice. And again, I want to just echo a lot of the comments you've made that clearly there are some challenges, but there's also patients that can be well served. And if we can leverage the number of community sites out there that also take care of a number of these patients, I think that that's a perfect strategy to help enroll patients that often are underrepresented in studies and maybe get a better demographic of the patients in the US population that never set foot in an academic setting. So again, I'm so encouraged by the work that you're doing, and I look forward to seeing more from you in the near future. And I just want to let everyone know that our next Brown Bag Community Series will be July 13th, because we all know that there's important congresses coming up in June, and we hope we'll see more practice-changing therapies emerge. And so we're going to give you the month of June off, but July 13th, I'll be chatting with Dr. Gwen Nichols, the Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer of Blood Cancer United, to talk about how do we address the funding gaps and how do we leverage some of these disease-specific organizations to address those funding gaps. So I appreciate everyone that was here today. And again, Luke, really pleasure to meet you. I appreciate you letting us pick your brain. And I'm so glad you joined us today.
Thank you guys. Thanks for having me.